Hi, this is Mark from LongIslandWatch.com, and welcome to episode number 2 of Watch and Learn. I'd like to thank everybody for making Watch and Learn number 1 such a success. I'm glad everybody liked it, and there was lots of constructive comments that were given. So I was going to go off in a different direction, but a lot of people asked about crystals of watches. So I figured I'd just throw that one in here next, and we'll talk about crystals that you'll find on the face of a watch. This is the glass that's covering the dial. We'll go through them. I'll show you each one. I've got 3 of them in front of you here representing the 3 main types. We'll go through them. We'll talk about each one, how you can tell what kind of crystal you have. And I'll try to keep it interesting, and even if you feel like you pretty much know everything about watches, hopefully you can learn something. For a newcomer to watches, I hope you pick up a lot of information that you'll find useful. So like I said, I've got 3 crystals in front of you here, ranging from left to right, from the least expensive to the most expensive. I've got what they call plastic, mineral, and sapphire. The sapphire has a cyclops on it. It really doesn't matter for purposes of this discussion. So we're going to talk about each one, and I'll start with the one in my hand now. This is acrylic, plastic, plexiglass, hesselite. It goes by many different names, but really what the take from it is that it is the least expensive. It's the one that's been around the longest. This is the one that's on all the vintage watches. It's the same material that was put on the mid-80s Datejusts. Never mind the Cyclops. This is not a Rolex crystal on here, but it's still a plexiglass crystal, acrylic, hesselite, whatever you want to call it. This particular crystal goes to a Junkers or a Zeppelin watch. It's a domed hesselite. And you can tell when you push on it, or you can't feel it obviously, but when you push on it, it feels. I'll say the word flimsy. It feels flimsy. It feels like plastic. This one has a metallic rim around it. That is for when it's pressed into the watch. It's not really a very water resistant watch that this goes on, but you can see here that the acrylic has a nice dome to it. I think you can really see the depth there. I mean, the material itself is quite thin. See, my thumb goes into it pretty far. But it's very deep. It's drawn deep. So what are the advantages of a hesselite crystal? Well, number one, as I said, they are inexpensive. They do not cost a lot to manufacture since it's plastic. They're formed, and they're not expensive to manufacture. And then from there, they're not expensive, obviously, for companies to put on them. The other big draw to them is that you can put a big dome on them because they're easy to manufacture, and you can form them however you want them. You can put a 1 to 2 millimeter dome on them, and it won't be as expensive on another crystal like a mineral or a sapphire, where you have to grind it in. So that's a big advantage. A disadvantage of them, obviously, because they're plastic, is that they do scratch. So if I were to take this metal tool and just run it across the surface, I would get a deep gouge on it. As long as the gouge isn't too deep, you can buff out scratches in plexiglass or acrylic crystals. There's a compound called polywatch. There's a lot of compounds out there, but polywatch is probably the most popular. It looks like toothpaste. It's a polishing compound where you'd put it on the crystal, you'd rub it in, you buff it. It looks like you were buffing a car, and it will buff out the scratches, and it also actually reflows or melts part of the crystal, and it fills in gouges. It does a really good job. So while you can easily damage it or scratch it, you can also easily repair it. So that's a really good thing. You can buy a tube of polywatch online and just leave it in your drawer, and once a year or whatever, whenever you need it, you could shine up the crystal, and it really does an amazing job. If it's so deep that your fingernail gets stuck in it and it's really a deep gouge, then it might be time for a new crystal. Again, they're inexpensive and they're easy to replace. You'll buy a watchmaker. So moving up, the next one we're going to look at is going to be probably the most common crystal. This is mineral. It's like a piece of glass. It's pretty much just like crown glass that you're used to in everyday life. Windows, picture frames, and that kind of deal. This is a slightly beveled mineral crystal, but they can be flat or they can be curved, domed, for whatever look the manufacturer wants. So, different to the one I just showed you, I can hit it with this tool, and I'm not going to do much to it, but you can hear it tink, 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 just like a piece of glass. If you drop it, it will shatter. If you drop your watch from a few feet, it will probably shatter. But it's, relatively scratch-proof. If you rub it against stones or rocks or other things, if you bump your hand against a building or a door frame, you're going to wind up, giving it little scratches. But if you're careful with it, it should look good for a very long time. It shouldn't really develop a lot of scratches. I mean, obviously it all depends on what you do with your watches. If you're really rough on them, it's gonna scratch up. But if you take it easy and you're kind to them, it should it should look good for a very long time. So if you do manage to scratch your mineral crystal, a lot of people ask, can you buff the scratches out? There is this poly watch, as I mentioned, for the Sli crystals. For mineral crystals, there is another compound. It's fairly scientific in name. I don't remember it. But it is a compound that's sold by companies. You can look it up online. And you pretty much do have to buff the crystal. If it's a deep scratch, forget it. You're probably not going to do it. But if it's just light surface scratching, yeah, you can do it. It may take a while, especially with non-mechanical means. I guess if you have a tool at your disposal, you could. But don't forget now, your crystal is going to be on a watch while you're doing this, so you really want to be careful that you don't scratch the case as well or buff the case. So yeah, you can buff out the scratches, but hopefully you don't mess it up. But again, you can always get replacement crystals for watches, whether from the manufacturer or from an aftermarket source. The advantages of this, again, they're not as inexpensive as the plexiglass. They're a little more expensive to produce, but still quite affordable. Disadvantage would be that it still does scratch, and it's a little less shatter resistant than I would say a sapphire is. But it's probably, as I said, the most popular type of crystal you'll find on a watch nowadays. This is the way they make these is they'll create a tube of glass. Picture a long dowel, with about this diameter of glass, and they'll cut it into little wafers, and then they'll take those wafers and they will polish them down until they get the desired shape, whether it be flat or dome like this one. And that brings me to the last one. Here is a sapphire crystal. Now this happens to be quite thick. This goes to a 200-meter water-resistant dive watch, so the crystal has to be thick to withstand all the pressure of the water. But thickness notwithstanding, sapphire is considered the most scratch-resistant material out there to make watch crystals. It's not real sapphire like you'd think the gem is. It is synthetic sapphire. They produce it I don't want to say they produce it the same way as a mineral crystal. It's a flame fusion process. If you're a chemist, you'll know what that means. But again, they make a long dowel of it. They slice it. Now this time they're going to be using diamond saws because nothing will really scratch this except for something as hard as it or harder. So they're going to use diamond saws. They'll slice it and then they'll grind it. In this instance, it's ground almost flat. They do add a cyclops to it afterwards. That is added on. It's not ground in. But again, that doesn't really matter. But you see, this is just, this is super thick. This is a very expensive crystal. It is mostly scratch resistant. You can really do a lot to a sapphire crystal. You can scratch it against almost anything out there except for a diamond or anything nearly as hard as diamond. This is on the Mohs scale of hardness. This is a number 9. So there's not much above it except for diamond that will scratch it. So as long as you don't go through a war with it, it will look new pretty much forever. And just as a case in point, I have a Zin here, which I've owned for over 10 years. It's got a sapphire crystal on it, and you'll see it's perfect. There's not a scratch on it. I don't wear the watch every day, but still, it gets banged around, and it still looks perfect. And what that will bring me to something else. You can see as I hold it in the light, you'll see it's not exactly a white light it's reflecting. This crystal has been treated with anti-reflective. So anti-reflective materials are only applied to sapphire because they are smooth enough to accept it. Anti-reflective is much like anti-glare that you get on your eyeglasses. It is a very thin layer, about a quarter wavelength thick, of material that's applied to the crystal. It can be inside, it can be outside, it can be both. It's really not a good idea to have it on the outside because if it scratches off, you'll see it. But it's a coating that pretty much just eliminates glare. And what it does, it makes the time easier to read, but what it also does, it more or less makes the crystal disappear when you're looking at the watch. And in this case, when you look at the Zin, I mean, you see the dial so well. At times, I've had people say to me, is there a crystal on your watch? And they'll go to touch it, and they know there is, but they'll be like, wow, I really can't see anything. So it really, AR, as they call it, anti-reflective, really does a great job. But again, AR is only added to sapphire crystal. So, so the advantages of sapphire, obviously, scratch, now I hate to say scratch proof, it's not. It's very scratch resistant. Disadvantages are expense. This costs much more than a mineral, much more than the original Hesalite that I showed you, and a decent amount more than the mineral crystal. Now, when we're talking about crystal prices, I mean, you can buy crystals on your own, but think about it from a watchmaker's perspective or from a watch manufacturer's perspective. They buy the crystals from a crystal manufacturer, and then they mark up the entire watch to the wholesaler, who then marks up the whole entire watch to the retailer. So, a little difference in price, all the way down the food chain adds up to be a big number, when you get to the retail level. So it's not uncommon to see sapphire crystal watches going for $50 to $100 more than their mineral counterparts. In fact, we sell two Seagulls where the acrylic version, this one, is $299, and the regular price for the sapphire version is $399. So it really makes a big difference in price. So let's say you do manage to scratch your sapphire crystal. Now you can imagine we've worked our way up in hardness now. Now we're in an area where pretty much nothing can scratch it except for something like a diamond. And I actually had a friend who did manage to scratch his crystal, and it was on a diamond. Him and his fiance were holding hands, and the diamond hit the crystal, and it caused a scratch. So the same thing applies. When we talked about mineral. Again, there's compounds that can do it. It may take, 20 or 30 minutes of continuous buffing to actually, get it away. Because, when you buff something like this, what you're doing is you're eroding the material, and it's going to take a while because it's really hard stuff. So yeah, I guess the short answer is yes, you can buff out scratches in sapphire. The longer answer is, no, it can take a lot of work, and it might be a pain. But it may be cheaper than, installing a new crystal. Now that we've discussed the three basic kinds of crystals, I just want to really touch on, something I didn't talk about, which is Seiko crystals. Seiko crystals are called hardlex. It's a Seiko proprietary compound. It's not like sapphire. It's harder than mineral, or maybe it is hardened mineral. No one really knows for sure, I'd say, because it's proprietary. But it's a little more scratch resistant than mineral, but it's nowhere near as scratch resistant, say, as sapphire is. So that's hardlex, and you will also see K1 hardened mineral crystal. Still a mineral crystal, it goes through a different hardening process, and they do increase the hardness of it, but it still does not approach sapphire. So if you have your watch and you want to know what kind of crystal you have on it, the first thing you would do is go to the manufacturer and see if they have that information. If you had a plexiglass or a Hesalite crystal, you would know it. You pick it up, you tap on it with your fingernail. It gives a very plasticky kind of feel. You can bend it. As I push my thumb into it, it yields. So you would know it. But then the real tough one comes from mineral and sapphire. How can you tell the difference? Thickness. You can make a sapphire really thin, and it'll sound, really rinky-dinky. And you can make a mineral, this one on my left, you can make it extremely thick. So you really can't tell by tapping. You can't tell too much by looking. The real way that professionals tell is they use a diamond tester, which is a conductivity tester, heat conductivity, because sapphire will conduct heat a lot better than standard glass will. So that's the real surefire way to tell. Now you may hear people mention a water droplet test, and I will do one for you in a second. The idea is that the smoothness of the crystal, and combine that with the polar properties of water. If it's on the sapphire, which is a smoother surface or a better surface, the water should pool up. When you drop water on it and it slides down, the water should form well-formed beads behind it. Whereas on a mineral crystal like this one, the water should trail and just leave a water trail down the side. So we're going to try it out. The first thing I'm going to do, even though I've got gloves on, is I'm going to clean both crystals thoroughly, and then we'll try the test. Okay, so now I've got both crystals. They're clean. I put them on a towel just so I don't wet my setup here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a dropper and I'm going to squeeze a drop of water onto the center of each crystal. And we know sapphire is on the left and minerals on the right. What should happen on the sapphire again is that I should get a well-formed bead, while on the mineral I'll still get a bead, but it should be a little bit sloppy. So here I come with a dropper. I'm going to put a drop of water somewhere in the middle. There you go. Makes a nice formed bead. And now on the mineral, made a bead, but do you see how it immediately flattened out like that? And that's an indicator that that it's not sapphire. Something important to note is that if there's anti-reflective coating on it, it could affect the test. So again, this isn't a surefire way. It's a pretty good way. If you really need to know for sure, you got to contact a jeweler or buy a conductivity tester. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pick up the crystal on the left, and we'll see what happens when the water droplet slides off. Went right off, nice and clean. And now on the mineral, see how it leaves a trail behind? Much different, much different result than the sapphire. The sapphire is actually, it's like clean. It's almost hydrophobic. The water just comes right off of it. So that will be a good way to tell. Again, not the most definitive way, but if you need to really know what kind of crystal your watch has, this is a real quick and dirty test. But you do have to make sure that your crystal is extremely clean. I used a alcohol wipe that you'd use for eyeglasses. So this has been Mark from LongIslandWatch.com showing you watch crystals all the way from plastic to mineral to sapphire. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to our channel if you have not done so yet. If you have any questions or comments, you want to see something else covered in the next Watch and Learn, let me know below. And I do respond to everything. I do read everything for sure. And that's how I got the idea for this video. The Watch and Learn series will continue. I have ideas on what I want to do next, but maybe you guys will come up with something else that'll be a good idea to cover. So anyway, signing off. Have a good one. Bye-bye.